Marrying an Arab millionaire, the young woman believed her life was about to enter a new, dazzling chapter filled with luxury and love. But dreams of opulence quickly unraveled into a chilling nightmare. Could she break free from the golden cage that now held her captive? It was a golden summer afternoon, and the Caribbean coastline sparkled like a dream waiting to unfold. Livia wandered along the shore, her bare feet sinking into the sun-kissed sand. With every step, her long, chestnut-brown hair danced in the soft breeze, framing her almond-shaped eyes that gazed thoughtfully across the endless ocean. At just 20 years old, Livia's future appeared as radiant as the sun above. She was young, ambitious, and on the path to becoming a nurse, a career she was passionate about and had tirelessly worked toward. Her days were simple, filled with a quiet peace that echoed the serene waves before her. But then she saw him. Standing a short distance away, his tall silhouette was outlined against the setting sun. His skin bore the bronzed hue of someone who lived under the sun's warm embrace, and his dark, penetrating eyes held a depth that seemed to guard unspoken secrets. Those eyes were fixed on her, filled with a curiosity that echoed her own. His name, she would later learn, was Mahdi. He was from Saudi Arabia, vacationing with his family in this tranquil corner of the world. For Livia, that first look felt like a scene from a fairy tale, the kind her mother had always cautioned her about, tales of strangers and the thrill of the unfamiliar. As Mahdi approached, his gaze softened, and his voice, marked by a gentle accent that made each word feel deliberately chosen, broke the silence. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" he said softly, his eyes drifting to the horizon she had just been admiring. Livia smiled, captivated by his quiet confidence and the mystery that seemed to surround him. The days that followed were like pages from a romantic novel, each encounter a secret to be cherished. They walked along the shoreline together, her laughter harmonizing with the whispering waves as she listened to his stories of distant lands. Mahdi painted vivid portraits of his world, vast desert landscapes, opulent palaces gleaming under golden suns, and traditions rooted in ancient history. Livia found herself enchanted, her imagination whisked away to a place she had never known. In return, she shared stories of her own simple life, of her close-knit family, of the modest but loving home she grew up in, and of her dreams to become a nurse and make a difference. Mahdi listened intently, his deep eyes never leaving hers, his attention making her heart race. Then, one evening, under a sky dusted with shimmering stars, Mahdi's words left her breathless. "Come with me to Saudi Arabia, Livia. Let me show you my world." His voice was gentle but earnest, his gaze unwavering as he reached out to her. Her heart skipped, excitement and fear intertwining. "But my studies, my family," she whispered, uncertainty coloring her words. Mahdi's smile was warm, his fingers gently brushing hers. "I'll take care of everything," he promised. "You won't have to worry about anything. Think of it as an adventure, a new beginning for both of us." That night, Livia lay awake, her thoughts swirling. The prospect of leaving behind everything she had ever known was terrifying, like standing at the edge of a precipice and staring into the unknown. Yet Mahdi's voice, his words, echoed in her mind, pulling her toward him, toward a life she could hardly imagine. The next morning, Livia confided in her mother. Concern filled her mother's eyes as she listened, but she also saw the spark of excitement in her daughter's face, a flame too bright to extinguish. With a heavy sigh, she whispered, "Be careful, my child. The world is not always as kind as it appears." Yet, wrapped in dreams of faraway lands and a love that felt like destiny, Livia barely heard her mother's warning. Her mind was already miles away, imagining the life Mahdi had promised. A life that seemed to shimmer just beyond her reach. With her mother's hesitant blessing, Livia packed her bags, her heart a whirlwind of anticipation and apprehension. She boarded the plane to a land she had only heard of in stories, her imagination running wild with visions of adventure and romance, never once grasping the reality that awaited her. Upon arriving in Riyadh, the city unfolded before her like a living postcard. The skyline was a mesmerizing tapestry of glass and steel, gleaming skyscrapers stretching toward the heavens, while below, bustling markets and ancient minarets painted a picture of tradition meeting modernity. Yet, nothing could have prepared her for the breathtaking sight of Mahdi's home. The mansion stood grand and majestic, an oasis of luxury surrounded by the sprawling desert. Its lush gardens and ornate fountains sparkled under the golden sun, a striking contrast against the sandy landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly beyond its gates. That evening, beneath glittering chandeliers and amidst an opulent dinner setting, Maid rose from his seat, his eyes soft but unwavering. With a graceful movement, he lowered himself onto one knee, his voice rich with emotion as he gazed deeply into her eyes. "My beloved Livia, will you honor me by becoming my wife?" His words hung in the air, and for a moment, time stood still. Livia felt her heart race, her breath catching as she looked at the man who had opened the door to a world she never imagined possible. She could feel the weight of his words, a promise of love and a future that seemed like a dream. Her chest tightened with excitement and fear, and before she could fully comprehend her emotions, she heard herself whisper, "Yes." From that moment on, Maid renewed his proposal night after night, his persistent devotion eroding her initial reservations. Each evening, his words were infused with tenderness, his gaze full of hope, and slowly, Livia found herself surrendering to the allure of his love and the enchantment of her new surroundings. Perhaps, she thought, she could truly belong to this world while holding on to her own identity. A week after her arrival, with her heart fluttering and her thoughts a tangled web of emotions, Livia finally accepted Maid's proposal. Her yes ignited a spark of joy that seemed to light up the entire mansion. And without delay, preparations began for a wedding that promised to be nothing short of magnificent. Dazed by how quickly everything was unfolding, Livia felt overwhelmed by the whirlwind of events. She yearned to share her news with her mother. Her hands shook as she dialed the familiar number, her voice a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Mom," she began, her words trembling, "I'm getting married to Maid." A heavy silence hung on the other end before her mother finally spoke, her tone laced with worry and disbelief. "Livia, are you certain? It's all happening so fast. You hardly know him, and his world is so different from ours." But Livia, blinded by love and promises of a life she could barely imagine, dismissed her mother's fears, reassuring her that everything would be fine. As the days flew by, Livia found herself caught in a flurry of wedding preparations, an enchanting chaos of silks, jewels, and the intoxicating aroma of exotic perfumes. The women of Maid's family surrounded her, guiding her through the customs and traditions expected of a wife in their culture. Livia embraced it all, eager to learn and desperate to belong. When her own family arrived, their faces were a blend of joy and unease. Her mother clung to her tightly, her whispered words a soft plea. "It's not too late to change your mind, sweetheart." But Livia, swept away by the love and luxury enveloping her, shook her head. "I'm happy, Mom. Everything will be all right." The wedding was a breathtaking spectacle of opulence and tradition, a celebration that seemed to come straight out of a fairy tale. Dressed in an exquisite gown that sparkled with intricate gold embroidery, Livia felt like royalty. Standing beside Maid, his eyes reflecting a love that seemed to know no bounds, she felt her doubts dissolve. The festivities stretched over 3 days, filled with music, laughter, and customs she was only beginning to understand. But after the last petal had fallen and the final guests had departed, the time came for goodbyes. Maid gently suggested that Livia's family return home, assuring them that the newlyweds needed space to begin their life together. Still wrapped in a cocoon of happiness and excitement, Livia barely noticed the hesitation in her family's farewells. She stood at the grand entrance, waving as their car disappeared into the desert horizon. As the sun dipped below the vast dunes, a strange feeling settled over Livia, a weight pressing against her chest. It was as if the world she had known all her life was slipping away, leaving her behind in this unfamiliar paradise. Surrounded by unimaginable luxury, yet feeling an inexplicable emptiness, Livia realized that she was truly alone, standing at the edge of a new world that was both beautiful and terrifying. The first days of marriage were like a living dream. Maid showered Livia with affection, extravagant gifts, and sweet whispers of eternal love. They wandered through the mansion's sprawling gardens, dined under the stars, and talked for hours about their hopes and dreams. Livia felt like she was living a fairy tale, but slowly, the enchantment began to fade as she noticed subtle changes in Maid's demeanor. What once seemed like acts of love and care gradually revealed themselves as layers of control. The first sign was his request, no, his insistence, that she delete her social media accounts. "You're my wife now," he said softly, though his voice held an edge of finality. "You don't need those distractions. Everything you need is here with me." Livia was stunned. Her social media profiles were her only connection to the world she had left behind, her link to her family and friends in the United States. She tried to reason with him, explaining how much it meant to stay connected to her loved ones. But Maddie's expression hardened, his tone growing cold. "The outside world is full of negativity," he said, his eyes narrowing. "It will only poison what we have here. This is for your own good." Hesitant but wanting to keep the peace, Livia agreed, telling herself it was a small price to pay for love. Soon after, Maid presented her with an entirely new wardrobe, a collection of elegant abayas and veils. "These are the clothes suitable for my wife," he explained, his voice firm but affectionate. Livia hesitated, the thought of abandoning her Western clothes unsettling. She tried to compromise, softly suggesting, "But I'm not Muslim, can't I dress a bit more in line with my own culture?" His face grew stern, his voice devoid of its usual warmth. "You are my wife now, Livia. You must respect my traditions. In time, you will understand and appreciate our way of life." Feeling the weight of his expectations, Livia reluctantly gave in, convincing herself that it was part of adapting to her new world. But the restrictions did not stop there. Her outings became rare and meticulously monitored, limited to family gatherings or social events where Maid was always by her side, his watchful eyes never leaving her. Her calls to her family in America grew infrequent, short, and always under his supervision. One afternoon, Maid approached her with another demand. She was to delete all her contacts, including her mother's number. "You don't need them anymore," he said firmly. "I am your family now." Livia's heart sank as she pleaded tearfully to keep at least her mother's contact. But Maid was unyielding, his voice cold and decisive. "It's for your own good so you can fully embrace your new life." Reluctantly, and feeling a growing void inside her, Livia obeyed. Gradually, Livia's identity began to dissolve. Her colorful Western outfits were replaced by the monochrome layers of abayas and veils. Her cheerful, confident English gave way to hesitant, subdued Arabic. Her dreams of becoming a nurse faded into distant memories, overshadowed by the expectations of being an obedient, dutiful wife. Maid rationalized every rule, every restriction, as acts of love and protection. "The outside world is dangerous," he would say. "Here, you are safe and cherished. What more could you want?" With time, the voice inside her that protested grew weaker, slowly succumbing to his narrative. Then came the news of her pregnancy. For a brief moment, joy pierced through the dark clouds that had gathered around her life. Maid was overjoyed, proclaiming that the child was a divine blessing, the ultimate proof of their love. But Livia quickly realized that her pregnancy only deepened his control. Under the pretense of safeguarding her health and the baby's well-being, Maid restricted her movements even further. She was no longer allowed to leave the mansion unaccompanied, not even to stroll in the gardens she once loved. Every aspect of her life became regimented: meals, rest, even her thoughts were no longer her own. As her body grew heavy with new life, her world grew smaller, until the once majestic mansion felt like a prison gilded with luxury. Her only comfort was the child growing inside her, a fragile connection to the person she once was, to the life she had left behind. She spoke to her baby in quiet whispers, sharing her fears and dreams, desperate to keep alive some piece of herself amidst the suffocating control that had taken over her existence. Meanwhile, her family back in the United States grew increasingly worried. The few phone calls they received were brief, guarded, and always with Maid in the background, his presence palpable even through the phone line. Her mother heard the emptiness in Livia's voice, a dullness that was foreign and chilling. Determined to see her daughter, Livia's parents flew across the world, arriving at the grand gates of Maid's mansion. They were met by Maid himself, his face a mask of cold courtesy. "Livia is resting," he informed them, his tone polite but firm. "The pregnancy has been difficult, and she cannot receive visitors." Her parents' pleas were met with the same unyielding response. "She is my wife, and I am responsible for her well-being. I will not let anything disturb her peace." Desperation filled her mother's eyes as she pleaded, "Please, just let us see her, even for a moment." But Maid's demeanor remained rigid, his authority absolute. "It's not possible. I must protect her and our child." With heavy hearts and a sense of helplessness that cut deeper than words, her parents were forced to leave, watching the gates close behind them, locking their daughter away from their reach. Inside the mansion, Livia stood by the window, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. She had watched from a distance, unseen as her parents were turned away. Tears streamed down her face as she pressed her palm against the glass, longing to reach out, to scream, to run after them. But her voice had been silenced long ago, her freedom surrendered to the man who claimed to love her. She realized then that she was more than just a wife or an expectant mother. She was a prisoner in a golden cage, trapped between love and control, dreams and reality. Livia's parents stood at the massive gates, their hearts breaking as they pleaded to see their daughter, but Maddie's face remained cold and unyielding. "Livia is my wife now," he declared, with a finality that left no room for argument. "She lives under my protection, by my customs. She no longer needs outside influences." His words were sharp, his stance unwavering. With no other choice, Livia's parents returned to America, their hearts heavy and shattered, never having laid eyes on her. On the plane ride home, her mother wept silently, tears tracing lines of despair down her face. Guilt gnawed at her, whispering cruelly that she had failed her daughter, that she should have fought harder. Yet all she could do was stare out at the endless sky, praying that somehow Livia would find her way back to them. Meanwhile, in the grand, silent mansion, Livia slept, completely unaware that her parents had been so close. Maddie had sedated her, claiming it was necessary for the baby's health. When she finally woke, disoriented and groggy, Maddie was by her side, his expression calm but steely. "Your parents called," he said softly, his words deliberate and firm. "They won't be coming back. They understand now that this is your life." A cold wave of numbness swept over Livia, leaving her hollow. It felt as though the last thread tying her to her old life, to the woman she once was, had been cut. She curled up in bed, clutching her swollen belly, whispering softly to the child inside her, "I will protect you. I promise. You will be free." But as her words floated through the still air, a part of her wondered if she was making a promise she couldn't keep. Months passed, and with the birth of her first child, a son named Sammy, a flicker of light entered Livia's dark world. Holding her newborn son, she felt a love so powerful that it brought tears to her eyes. Sammy became her lifeline, her joy amidst the shadows. She sang him gentle American lullabies, her voice trembling as she whispered words from a world that seemed like a distant memory. For brief moments, she felt like herself again, connected to the life she once knew. But those moments were fleeting, quickly replaced by the harsh reality of her situation. Maddie's excitement over fatherhood soon morphed into a new form of control. He was adamant that Sammy be raised strictly by Islamic tradition, with no trace of Western influence. Every attempt Livia made to introduce a piece of her culture, a lullaby, a story, even a word of English, was swiftly and sternly shut down. "Our children will grow up knowing my world, my values," Maddie insisted, his tone brooking no argument. Just months after Sammy's birth, Livia was stunned to learn she was pregnant again. She was torn between joy at the thought of another child and fear of the world they would be born into. Exhausted and overwhelmed, she felt her spirit sink further as her world grew smaller. The mansion, with its vast halls and ornate rooms, became a beautiful prison that held her captive, isolated and alone. The second pregnancy was more difficult, both physically and emotionally. Livia was confined even more, her days an endless cycle of caring for Sammy while preparing for the arrival of her next child. When she gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful girl Maddie named Hanita, Livia felt an overwhelming love, but also a crushing sense of responsibility. She was now the mother of 2 children in a world where her voice was silenced and her choices were no longer her own. Maddie's control tightened even more after Hanita's birth. Declaring that a good mother's place was at home, he refused to hire any help, insisting that Livia devote herself fully to raising their children. Her days were spent in a haze of exhaustion, her nights filled with silent tears as she longed for the support of her own mother, for the laughter of friends she could no longer speak to. Memories of her old life haunted her, vivid and painful reminders of the freedom she had once taken for granted. Though she was surrounded by unimaginable wealth, designer clothes, exquisite jewelry, and a mansion that sparkled like a palace, Livia felt more empty than she had ever thought possible. The luxury around her was nothing more than gilded bars, and she was the beautiful bird trapped inside, admired but never free. Maddie, once charming and affectionate, grew increasingly distant, consumed by his work and his obsession with control. When he was home, he devoted his time to enforcing rigid rules about the children's upbringing, monitoring Livia's every move. His jealousy bordered on paranoia. He forbade her from any interaction with men, including distant male relatives. Even on the rare occasions they went out together, Maid watched her like a hawk, his gaze scrutinizing every gesture, every word. Livia felt his control seep into every corner of her life, choking her like invisible chains. The mansion became her prison, its grandeur mocking her helplessness. She was trapped behind walls of gold and glass, surrounded by beauty but completely isolated from the world outside. Her days were filled with a crushing routine, her spirit wilting under Maid's relentless authority. Her only solace was in the quiet moments with her children. She would cradle Sammy and Hanita close, singing them soft lullabies and whispering stories from her childhood, memories of a world they might never know. In those moments, she allowed herself to dream of freedom, to imagine a life where she could laugh and love without fear. But those dreams were always fleeting, shattered by the sound of Maddie's footsteps echoing through the hallways, a reminder of the cage she was trapped in. Livia realized then that she was living a paradox, surrounded by wealth but starved of freedom, adored yet controlled, loved but imprisoned. She was a beautiful bird in a gilded cage, longing to spread her wings but chained by a love that had turned to possession. And as she rocked her children to sleep, she made them the same silent promise she had whispered to her unborn child months before: "I will protect you. I will find a way out." One day. Livia's days blended together in a numbing cycle of repetition. Wake up, tend to the children, pray, a practice Maid insisted she adopt as part of her new identity. Then more childcare, and finally restless sleep. There was no space for her own dreams, no room for her own thoughts. Her life was dictated by a rigid routine that left her feeling like a ghost of herself, drifting through the corridors of a golden prison. In stolen moments of solitude, Livia allowed herself to dream of escape. She imagined running away with her children, fleeing back to America, to freedom. She envisioned the salty breeze of the Caribbean beaches where she had first met Maid, her children laughing and playing by the shore, unshackled by rules that were suffocating her. But reality crushed her fantasies. She had no money, no passport, and no way to contact the outside world. Every avenue of escape was barred, as securely as if the windows had iron grills. Just as her spirit began to collapse under the weight of her imprisonment, Livia discovered she was pregnant for the third time. The realization hit her like a thunderbolt, leaving her breathless and terrified. 3 children in under 3 years, her body was weary, her mind exhausted, her spirit broken. When she told Maid, his face lit up with elation. "Allah has truly blessed us," he proclaimed, his eyes gleaming with pride. "Our legacy grows strong." For Livia, his words were like stones dragging her deeper into despair. This third pregnancy felt like a life sentence. Her body, already worn down from consecutive pregnancies, ached with fatigue. Her mind spiraled into darkness, depression wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. Days blurred together as she stared blankly out of her window, her gaze drifting across the barren desert, wishing desperately for a horizon that held hope. Her children were her only light in the darkness. She held them close, her love for them fierce and overwhelming. In their innocent faces she saw fragments of herself, of the life she had once known, of the freedom she had lost. She began to whisper stories to them, quiet tales about America, the beaches she had walked, the family they had never met. She painted pictures of a world she was determined they would one day see. Those stolen moments, those whispered dreams, kept her spirit alive. They became her fuel, her reason to fight. Slowly, Livia began to formulate a plan. She watched the rhythm of the house with careful eyes. When Maid left for business, when the guards changed shifts, the rare moments she had access to a phone or computer. She memorized every detail, every opportunity, storing them carefully in her mind as she waited for the right moment to act. Life continued in its monotonous rhythm. Maid, pleased with his growing family and confident in his complete control over Livia, began to relax his rules ever so slightly. He permitted her to take the children to the garden, though always under the vigilant eyes of security guards. But even this small taste of freedom gave Livia a glimmer of hope. It was during one of these garden walks that she found her first real chance to connect with the outside world. As she watched her children play, An older gardener approached, his movements casual as he pretended to prune the bushes nearby. He glanced around, his eyes cautious and kind. In a low, trembling voice, he whispered, "Madam, if you ever need help, there are people who can help you." Livia's heart leaped into her throat, her pulse pounding wildly. Was this real, or was it another one of Maddie's cruel tests of her loyalty? Fear and hope battled within her as she looked at the gardener's weathered face. With trembling hands, she accepted the tiny slip of paper he discreetly passed to her, hiding it deep within her clothes before anyone could notice. That night, under the guise of taking a long bath, Livia locked herself in the bathroom and pulled out the slip of paper. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, her eyes filling with tears as she read the words, "Call if you need help." Beneath the message was a single phone number. She pressed the paper to her heart, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. Then, knowing the danger it posed, she memorized the number and carefully destroyed the paper, flushing the remnants away to ensure no trace remained. The days that followed were filled with agonizing indecision. She had the number, a lifeline, but what would happen if she was caught? Her longing for freedom clashed violently with her fear of the consequences. If she failed, would Maid punish her? Would he take her children away? Would she lose them forever? The risks were enormous and the stakes were higher than she could bear. As she wrestled with her fears, Livia began to notice unsettling changes in Maid's behavior. His moods became erratic, swinging unpredictably between unnerving sweetness and terrifying anger. His control tightened even further. He insisted that she memorize long passages from the Quran, pressuring her to fully adopt his faith. "You must become one of us," he demanded, his eyes fierce with authority. "Your old life no longer exists." His demands grew more extreme. He monitored her every movement, even within the confines of the mansion. Her phone, her internet access, everything was watched. Livia felt her world shrinking further, the walls of her prison pressing in on her. But even as the cage tightened, she held onto the phone number in her memory, clutching it like a key to her freedom. Livia knew she had to be careful, patient. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. She began to practice small acts of resistance, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but significant enough to keep her spirit alive. She hummed American lullabies to her children, whispered English words to them, and dreamed of the day she would call that number and finally break free. Each day she held her children close, pressing kisses to their tiny foreheads, whispering promises of freedom they were too young to understand. "One day," she swore to them, "one day I will get us out of here. One day we will be free." And with that promise burning in her heart, Livia prepared herself for the fight of her life. It was during one of Maid's violent outbursts that Livia made her decision. He had caught her reading an American fairy tale to the children, a book she had secretly hidden, a relic of her past life. In a fury, he tore the book to shreds, his face contorted with rage. "If you dare defy me again, I'll send them away," he threatened, his voice cold and final. "To a religious school where they will learn obedience." That night, as darkness enveloped the mansion, Livia lay in bed, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She knew she could not wait any longer. The time to act was now. Quietly, she slipped out of bed, moving through the shadowed hallways, her body tense with fear. She crept into Maid's study, where she knew he kept a phone locked in a drawer. Her hands trembled as she turned the key and retrieved the phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed the number she had memorized weeks before. The line rang once, then twice, before a voice answered, a voice that felt like salvation. "Livia?" The sound of her own name broke her, tears streaming down her face as she whispered desperately, "Please, please help me. I want to go home." Her voice cracked with emotion, her shoulders trembling as she leaned against the desk for support. "I can't stay here any longer. I'm trapped, please." The person on the other end spoke calmly, their voice steady and reassuring. "We'll help you. Stay strong. Help is on the way." Relief flooded Livia's body, her knees nearly buckling as she whispered her gratitude, tears slipping down her face. She ended the call, pressing the phone to her heart, her hope flickering like a fragile flame. But then she heard it, a sound that froze her blood, a sharp intake of breath. She spun around, terror seizing her to find Maid standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of rage and betrayal, his eyes burning with fury. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice low and venomous. He advanced toward her, his movements swift and predatory. Livia's scream was cut off as Maddie's hand clamped over her mouth, his grip punishing. His eyes were dark with anger, his voice dripping with contempt. "After everything I've given you, this is how you repay me?" He shook her, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "You ungrateful woman." Panic surged through Livia as she struggled to break free, but Maddie's strength was overwhelming. He dragged her out of the study, his hands still covering her mouth, her muffled cries echoing through the empty halls. The children awoke to the noise, their frightened cries piercing the night. The sound shattered Livia's heart, her maternal instincts igniting. "Let me go," she screamed as Maddie finally removed his hand. "You're hurting me. You're scaring them." Maddie's face contorted with anger, his voice a growl. "You dare to accuse me? After all I've given you, luxury, security, a family? And you tried to betray me, to run away like a thief in the night?" His words were like knives cutting deep, but Livia's spirit refused to break. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at him, her voice shaking but defiant. "I never asked for any of this," she cried, her eyes blazing with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "I just wanted love, freedom. I wanted to be myself." Her voice grew stronger, her words sharp and fierce. "This isn't love, Maddie, it's control. You don't love me, you just want to own me. I am not your possession." For a brief moment, shock flickered across Maddie's face, his grip loosening slightly, but then his expression hardened, his eyes cold as ice. "Fine," he spat, his voice devoid of emotion. "If freedom is what you want, then I'll give you a choice. You can stay here as my wife and be with your children, or you can leave, but they stay with me." The world seemed to tilt around Livia, her vision blurring as his words sank in. "No," she gasped, her voice breaking. "You can't. They're my children. You can't take them from me." Maddie's lips curled into a cold, cruel smile. "Oh, but I can. Here, the children belong to their father. If you leave, you'll never see them again. They will forget you, and you'll be nothing but a distant memory." His words were brutal, calculated to break her spirit, and they struck her like physical blows. Livia felt the ground give way beneath her, her legs collapsing as she sank to the floor. The room spun around her, her heart splintering into pieces. She looked up at Maddie, her face streaked with tears, her voice a shattered whisper. You're a monster!" His expression softened, but his eyes remained cold. He knelt beside her, his voice low and persuasive. "It doesn't have to be this way, my love. Stay here, with me, with our children. Forget this foolishness, and everything will go back to normal." His fingers brushed her hair, his touch a mockery of tenderness. "We can be a family, if you just obey." In that moment, Livia realized that she was truly a prisoner, not just of the gilded mansion or Maddie's controlling grip, but of a cruel system that would strip her of her children if she dared to fight back. She was trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The days that followed were unbearable. Maddie's control grew tighter, his surveillance absolute. The phones were disconnected, the computers removed. He watched her constantly, his presence a looming shadow that followed her everywhere. The walls of her prison closed in, suffocating her. Yet, amidst her despair, Livia felt a fierce determination ignite within her. Every time she looked at her children, her resolve strengthened. She could not allow them to grow up in this world of fear and oppression. She would not let them become pawns in Maddie's cruel game. No matter the cost, she would find a way to break free. Livia began to plan, her mind working tirelessly as she observed every detail, memorized every routine. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her children, for their future. And she swore to herself, with tears in her eyes and fire in her heart, "I will not let him win. I will not let him take them from me. I will fight, and I will get us out of here." It was no longer just about escape. It was about survival, about reclaiming her freedom, her identity, her life. Livia was ready to fight for herself and for her children, and nothing would stop her. One night, as the cold silence of the mansion enveloped her, Livia made the most excruciating decision of her life. She knew it would shatter her heart, but it was the only way to survive, to fight another day. With trembling hands, she packed a small bag with her few personal belongings, slipping her wedding ring off and placing it on the dresser as a symbol of her resolve. Her heart felt like it was breaking as she crept into her children's rooms, her footsteps silent on the plush carpet. She stood over their beds, watching them sleep, their faces angelic and peaceful in the silver glow of the moonlight. Tears blurred her vision as she leaned down and kissed their soft cheeks, her lips lingering as if to etch the memory into her soul. "I love you," she whispered, her voice breaking as she brushed her fingers through Sammy's hair. "Never forget that Mama loves you, and I will come back for you. I promise." Her heart felt as though it were being torn from her chest as she kissed Hanita's tiny forehead, her hands shaking as she pulled the blanket up to her daughter's chin. "Be brave, my loves. Be strong." Her body felt heavy as she forced herself to leave the room, her shoulders hunched with grief. She knew she was leaving behind the most precious pieces of herself, but she couldn't stay. Not if she wanted to survive. Not if she wanted to find a way to fight for them someday. With tears streaming down her face, Livia made her way to Maid's study. Her heart raced as she opened drawers, frantically searching for her passport. She knew he kept important documents locked away, and she needed that passport if she had any hope of escaping. As her fingers dug through papers, she heard a sound behind her, a soft creak that made her freeze. Turning slowly, she found Maid standing in the doorway, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. His eyes were cold, his lips curled in a sneer as he stepped into the room, his posture rigid with anger. "So, you've made your choice," he said, his voice dangerously calm, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Livia straightened her back, her shoulders squared as she met his gaze, her chin lifted defiantly. "Yes," she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "I can't live like this anymore, Maid. This isn't love. It's a prison, and I refuse to be your prisoner for one more day." Maid's eyes darkened, his jaw clenching as he took another step closer. "After everything I've given you, this is how you repay me?" His voice was a low growl, the pain and anger twisting his features. "I gave you a life of luxury, a family, everything you could ever want, and you dare to betray me?" Livia's eyes blazed with a fire she hadn't felt in years. "You gave me a cage," she snapped, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You took my freedom, my identity, my dreams. You tried to erase who I am. That isn't love, Maid. It's control, it's possession, and I won't let you own me anymore." For a moment, Maid looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, a flicker of shock crossing his face before his expression hardened. "Fine," he said coldly, his voice like ice. "You want to leave? Then leave. But you'll do it on my terms?" He pulled out a document from his desk and slammed it down in front of her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Sign this," he commanded, his voice flat and emotionless. Livia's heart sank as she read the document, her hands trembling as she realized what it was. An agreement relinquishing all rights to her children. Her knees nearly buckled as the words blurred before her eyes, the horror sinking in. "You can't ask me to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They're my children. You can't take them from me." Maid's eyes were cold, his jaw set in determination. "It's this or nothing. If you leave, they stay. If you want your freedom, you give up your rights to them. It's your choice." Livia felt the ground crumbling beneath her, her world collapsing as she stared at the man she had once loved. Her heart screamed inside her chest, her body shaking with the enormity of the choice before her. If she stayed, she would lose herself completely. If she left, she would lose them. Her vision blurred with tears as she picked up the pen, her hand trembling uncontrollably. Each stroke of her signature felt like a dagger to her heart, each letter carving away a piece of her soul. When she finished signing, she felt hollow, as if she had just condemned herself to an existence without meaning. Maid took the document, his eyes cold as he glanced over it before nodding. "Your things are ready. The driver will take you to the airport." His voice was devoid of any emotion, his gaze hard and unforgiving. "Do not contact the children. Do not come back. If you do, the consequences will be severe." Livia's heart shattered as she nodded numbly, her voice gone, her spirit broken. She picked up her small suitcase, her body moving mechanically as she followed him out of the house. As she walked down the grand staircase, she stole one last glance at the mansion that had been her gilded cage. She could still hear her children's soft breathing, see their angelic faces in her mind. The drive to the airport passed in a haze. She felt like a ghost, her body present, but her heart and soul left behind in that mansion. It wasn't until the plane was in the air, the lights of Riyadh shrinking beneath her, that the reality of what she had done crashed over her. She was free, but at the cost of everything that mattered. Tears poured down her face, her body shaking with silent sobs as she pressed her forehead to the cold window. She felt shattered, incomplete, broken beyond repair. She had left her children behind, pieces of her heart left in that beautiful prison. When the plane touched down in the US, Livia felt like a stranger in her own land. The familiar sights and sounds felt foreign, empty without the laughter of her children. She walked through the airport like a shadow, her body hollow and numb. But amidst the darkness, a spark of resolve flickered within her. She had signed that terrible document. She had left them behind, but she would never abandon them in her heart. No matter how long it took, no matter what she had to do, she would find a way to bring them back to her. As she stepped out into the familiar air of her homeland, Livia whispered to the wind, her voice filled with determination, "I will come back for you. I will fight, and I will bring you home." Her journey wasn't over. It was only just beginning. With unyielding resolve, Livia stepped onto American soil, her heart heavy with sorrow but blazing with determination. The sun that once warmed her with joy now felt cold, mocking the emptiness within her. She walked through the streets of her hometown like a ghost, everything familiar yet foreign, each corner echoing with memories of a life that seemed like it belonged to another woman. She fought to keep her tears at bay, her vision blurring as she stumbled through a world that no longer felt like her own. When she reached her family's doorstep, her mother's face lit up with joy, her arms flung open to welcome her home. But the happiness faltered when her eyes scanned the space behind Livia, searching for the small faces that were missing. "Where are my grandchildren?" Her mother's voice trembled, the hope in her eyes wavering. Livia's chest tightened, her lips quivering as she tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. They were strangled by the sobs that surged up her throat. She collapsed into her mother's embrace, her body shaking as the tears finally broke free. Between gasps and choked cries, she told them everything. About the golden prison she had been trapped in, the control that had suffocated her, and the impossible choice she had been forced to make. Her father listened in stony silence, his hands clenched into tight fists, the anger in his eyes blazing. Her mother held her close, tears streaming down her own face as she wept for her daughter's pain and the loss of the grandchildren she had never known. In the days that followed, the house was filled with a mixture of sorrow and rage, comfort and determination. Livia's family rallied around her, their love unwavering, their support relentless. But even as they tried to piece her shattered heart back together, Livia's mind was consumed by a singular purpose: to get her children back. With a fire in her heart and steel in her spine, she began the arduous battle for justice. She visited law firms, contacted human rights organizations, and pleaded for help from anyone who would listen. But every door she knocked on seemed to close in her face. The legal system was a labyrinth, the international laws tangled and complex, and the agreement she had signed, the document that relinquished her rights to her own children, was a weapon Maid wielded from across the ocean. The lawyers explained the harsh reality. The laws in the Middle East were stacked against her, and the custody agreement was nearly impossible to overturn. It was a battle fought on foreign soil, bound by cultural rules she didn't understand and legal frameworks she couldn't navigate. But Livia refused to give up. She spent sleepless nights researching similar cases, scouring legal precedents, searching for any loophole that could be her lifeline. She pored over international custody laws, read stories of mothers who had fought the same battle, and made notes on every strategy, every detail. Her laptop became her weapon, her mind a battleground as she fought for her children from thousands of miles away. But the emotional toll was crippling. Nightmares haunted her each night, twisted visions of her children reaching out to her, their faces etched with fear and longing. She saw Sammy's little hand stretching out, only to vanish into darkness. She heard Hanita's voice calling for her, only to wake up to the cold emptiness of her bed. She would bolt upright, her body drenched in sweat, her heart pounding as guilt wrapped itself around her like a noose. Her days were no easier. The weight of her choices crushed her, the question gnawing at her constantly. Had she made the right decision? Should she have stayed in that gilded cage, endured the control and oppression just to be near her children? But then she remembered the fear in Sammy's eyes when Maid yelled, the way Hanita hid behind her whenever their father's voice grew cold. She remembered Lex's trembling lips, his small body shrinking with fear, and she knew that she had to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for them. She tried countless times to contact Maid, to plead with him, to reason with him. She sent emails that went unanswered, made phone calls that never connected. It was as if he had vanished, taking her children and erasing her from their lives. Her heart broke a little more with every failed attempt, the silence echoing with her despair. Realizing that she was fighting a war on two fronts, one against a foreign legal system and one within herself, Livia sought help. With the unwavering support of her family, she began therapy, facing the trauma of the past few years and the pain of the choices that had led her here. Each session was grueling, forcing her to confront her fears, her regrets, her guilt. But slowly, piece by piece, she began to rebuild herself. Determined to reclaim her identity, she picked up her nursing studies, the dream she had abandoned for a life that turned into a nightmare. Each textbook she opened, each exam she passed, felt like an act of defiance, a way to take back the power she had lost. With every step forward, she felt herself becoming stronger, more resilient, more determined. But despite her personal victories, her legal battle remained stagnant. The lawyers' words were bleak, their voices heavy with sympathy as they explained that the custody agreement and the legal system in Saudi Arabia were nearly unbreakable barriers. They told her that the road ahead would be long, costly, and full of obstacles. But Livia refused to give up. One night, as she sat alone in her room, a photograph of her children clutched in her hands, she made a vow. "I will never stop fighting for you," she whispered, her voice firm and unyielding. "I will find a way. No matter how long it takes, no matter what it costs me, I will bring you home." She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew she would face setback after setback, heartbreak after heartbreak, but she would fight with every ounce of strength she had. She would fight until her last breath. She would fight for Sammy, for Lex, for Hanita, because they were her heart, her life, her everything. With this renewed determination, Livia dried her tears, lifted her head, and prepared for the hardest battle of her life. She would not rest until her children were safe in her arms again. She would fight, and she would win. She had no other choice. Her story was far from over. It was just beginning. It was during her darkest days that Livia met Marina, a woman whose story was a painful echo of her own. Like Livia, Marina had been separated from her children due to the cruel entanglement of international custody laws. But unlike Livia, Marina had managed to bring her children home. She had fought tooth and nail, facing threats and setbacks, but she had won. For the first time in years, Livia felt a flicker of hope. Marina told her about international organizations dedicated to cases of international child abduction, groups that specialized in navigating the complex web of international custody disputes. Determined to fight for her children, Livia threw herself into this new direction, contacting these organizations and sharing her story. To her astonishment, she found allies who understood her pain and were willing to stand beside her in her fight. Lawyers, advocates, and fellow mothers who had walked the same heartbreaking path rallied around her. They warned her that the journey would be long and fraught with challenges, but Livia was undeterred. She had nothing left to lose, only her children to gain. Meanwhile, life continued in Saudi Arabia for Sammy, little Hanita, and Lex. The days were filled with routines and rules, orchestrated by the nanny Maid had hired to care for them. Bitter and vengeful over Livia's departure, Maid told the children that their mother had abandoned them, that she no longer loved them. He spun lies designed to shatter their trust in her, to erase her from their hearts. But Sammy, the oldest, refused to believe it. He remembered his mother's hugs, the way she would whisper stories about America, about the beaches and the laughter. He remembered the songs she sang when no one was listening, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of her childhood. Every night, he whispered those stories to his younger siblings, keeping her memory alive. "She didn't leave us," Sammy told them, his voice strong and certain. "Mama loved us. She would never leave us, on purpose." Hanita, too young to remember much, clung to the fragments Sammy gave her, building a picture of a mother who loved her deeply. Lex, who was just a baby when Livia left, knew his mother only through his brother's stories, but he loved her fiercely all the same. Livia had become a mythical figure in their minds, a mother they could only dream of. Back in America, Livia fought tirelessly. Every day was a battle, each tiny victory bringing her one step closer to her children. She joined support groups for parents facing international custody battles, drawing strength from the community of mothers and fathers who understood her pain. She shared her story, spoke at forums, and became an advocate not only for her own children, but for countless others separated by borders and unjust laws. Her life became a whirlwind of legal meetings, advocacy work, and personal healing. She attended therapy, slowly piecing together the parts of herself that had been shattered. She resumed her nursing studies, determined to build a life she could one day share with her children. Each book she read, each exam she passed, felt like a step closer to reclaiming her identity, her power, her voice. Then, 5 long years after her return to America, Livia received news that changed everything. Carlos Mendoza, her dedicated attorney, walked into her office, his face lit with cautious optimism. "We found someone," he said, his voice steady but excited. "A lawyer in Saudi Arabia who's willing to take your case." Livia's heart skipped a beat, her body freezing as hope surged through her. "Are you serious?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Carlos nodded, his eyes shining. "Amir al-Assal. He's experienced with international custody disputes. It's not going to be easy, but if anyone can find a way, it's him." For the first time in 5 years, Livia felt the sun break through the darkness. It was a small crack in the wall that separated her from her children, but it was enough. She threw herself into this new fight, her heart ablaze with determination. She spent days preparing documents, writing affidavits, collecting every piece of evidence she could find to prove that her children needed her just as much as she needed them. In her lawyer's bustling office in New York, papers covered every surface, phones rang off the hook, and in the middle of it all, Livia sat, her face a mix of hope and fear. Across from her, Carlos spoke via video conference with Amir al-Assal, whose face appeared on the screen. "The situation is complicated," Amir explained, his voice calm but serious. "The agreement Livia signed is legally binding under Saudi law. It grants full custody to Maid." Livia's heart sank, her body going cold as she fought back tears. "But," Amir continued, his eyes meeting hers through the screen, "there are some gray areas. The agreement grants custody to Maid, but it doesn't explicitly forbid contact between Livia and the children. We could argue for supervised visits, at the very least." Livia's heart leapt, hope flaring inside her chest. It wasn't the victory she longed for, but the thought of seeing her children, even under supervision, was more than she had dared to dream. "Do you think it could work?" she asked, her voice small but firm. Amir hesitated, his gaze thoughtful. "It won't be easy," he admitted. "Maid has powerful connections and the courts are likely to favor him. But if we can prove that contact with you is in the children's best interest, we might have a chance." Carlos leaned forward, his face determined. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll prove that they need her. That this isn't just a legal battle. It's about the children's well-being." Livia's heart pounded as she looked from one lawyer to the other, her hands shaking. After 5 years of darkness, she could finally see a glimmer of light. It was a long shot, and the road ahead was treacherous, but she was ready to fight. That night, Livia sat alone in her room, looking at the photographs of her children she kept beside her bed. She traced their faces with her fingers, tears falling as she whispered, "Mama's fighting for you. I won't give up. We'll be together again." With that promise burning in her heart, Livia braced herself for the next battle. It would be a war waged in foreign courts against a powerful man in a country where the law was not on her side. But she had something stronger than any law, any obstacle. She had love. And with that love, she would fight until her last breath. This was not the end. It was only the beginning of the war for her children's freedom. The following months were a whirlwind of legal battles, sleepless nights, and tireless preparation. Livia threw herself into the fight with unwavering determination, working closely with Carlos and Amir. Every day was a race against time, gathering evidence, preparing testimonies, and constructing her case piece. Each night she pored over documents until her eyes were raw with exhaustion, searching for any detail, any loophole that might give her an edge. She knew she was facing an uphill battle, but she couldn't afford to make a single mistake. Her children's future depended on it. Meanwhile, life in Saudi Arabia carried on, but the absence of their mother left a void in the hearts of Sammy, Hanita, and Lex. Sammy, now 10 years old, had grown into the protector of his younger siblings. He was wise beyond his years, his gaze somber and guarded. Hanita, 8 years old, was a quiet and thoughtful child, her laughter rare but her eyes filled with questions she was too afraid to ask. Lex, the youngest at 7, was a burst of energy, curious, restless, and often confused by the changes in his family. Maid, bitter and resentful, had grown stricter and more distant. He ruled the household with an iron fist, his words sharp and cold. Whenever the children asked about their mother, his face hardened, his voice void of emotion as he repeated the same lie. "She abandoned you. She didn't love us enough to stay." But Sammy remembered. He remembered the warmth of his mother's hugs, the bedtime stories she whispered in secret, her soft voice painting pictures of a world beyond the walls of their home. He remembered her promise, the last words she had spoken to him that night. "I love you. Never forget that Mama loves you, and I will come back for you. I promise." He clung to those words like a lifeline, keeping her memory alive. Every night, he whispered his mother's stories to Hanita and Lex, weaving tales of courage and hope, ensuring they never forgot the love that once filled their home. After months of grueling preparation, the day of the first hearing finally arrived. Livia's heart pounded violently as she entered the Saudi courtroom, her body wrapped in conservative attire, her head covered in a scarf. The walls felt cold, the air heavy with tension. Her hands trembled, but she held her head high, her resolve unshakable. Maid was already there, his expression icy and emotionless. When their eyes met, Livia felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. This man, the one she had once loved, was now her fiercest enemy. His gaze was cold, his posture rigid, his heart closed off to her completely. The trial was brutal and exhausting. Amir argued with eloquence and passion, presenting Livia's case with meticulous detail. He spoke of the emotional trauma the children suffered without their mother, of the importance of her presence in their lives. He emphasized the bond between mother and child, arguing that no amount of wealth or comfort could replace a mother's love. But Maddie's lawyer was ruthless, twisting the narrative to paint Livia as an unstable woman who had willingly abandoned her children. He spoke of the agreement she had signed, using it as proof of her lack of commitment. "She left them behind," he argued coldly, his voice slicing through the courtroom. "She chose her freedom over her own children." Each word felt like a dagger, stabbing deep into Livia's heart. She fought to keep her tears at bay, her lips pressed together to silence the sobs threatening to escape. She wanted to scream, to tell the court the truth, that she had never abandoned her children, that she had been forced to make an impossible choice, but she knew she had to remain calm, composed, and resilient. She was fighting for them, and she couldn't afford to break. After days of testimony, cross-examinations, and fierce arguments, the judge finally announced that he would need time to deliberate. The verdict would be delivered in a month. That month was torture for Livia. She barely ate or slept, her mind consumed with worry and anticipation. Her parents and friends did everything they could to support her, but nothing could calm the storm raging inside her. Every night she lay awake, clutching the photos of her children, whispering their names through tears, praying for a miracle. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Livia stood outside the courtroom, her body trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. Her heart raced as she entered, her legs weak, her hands cold with fear. She forced herself to stand tall, to look Maddie in the eye without flinching. When the judge began to speak, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The courtroom was silent, every breath held as he delivered his verdict. After careful consideration of all aspects of this case, the judge announced, his voice firm but calm, "This court has decided that it is in the children's best interest to maintain some form of contact with their mother." Livia's heart skipped a beat, her vision blurring as tears filled her eyes. "Therefore," the judge continued, "the mother is granted monthly supervised visits with her children. These visits will take place in a natural environment under the supervision of a court-appointed social worker." A sob escaped her lips as she pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. After 5 long, agonizing years, she would finally see her children again. It wasn't the full custody she had prayed for, but it was the first step, the first crack in the wall that separated her from them. Maid's face twisted with fury, his fists clenched as his lawyer whispered heatedly in his ear. "I'll appeal this," he spat, his voice cold and venomous. "You'll never take them from me." But Livia stood tall, her shoulders back, her eyes shining with tears and hope. She had won this battle, and she would keep fighting no matter what. The first visit was scheduled for 2 weeks later. Livia counted down the days, her heart bursting with anticipation. She practiced the words she would say, rehearsed the hugs she would give, dreamed of the moment she would finally hold them in her arms. She was ready to show them how much she loved them, how fiercely she had fought for them, how she had never stopped believing in the promise she made all those years ago. "I will come back for you." And now, finally, she would. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new fight, a new chapter. She had opened the door, and she wouldn't stop until she brought them all the way home. This was just the beginning of her journey to reclaim her family. Livia spent every waking moment preparing for the reunion that had been 5 years in the making. She bought toys she hoped they would love, books she dreamed of reading to them, and clothes she imagined seeing them wear. She practiced what she would say, rehearsing the words again and again until she could speak them without breaking down. She wanted the meeting to be perfect, even though she knew that perfection was impossible. When the day finally came, she could barely breathe. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she walked into the sterile, unwelcoming visitation center. The walls were stark, the furniture cold and impersonal, but for Livia, it was the most beautiful place in the world because her children would be there. She waited, her hands trembling, her throat tight with anticipation and fear. The door creaked open, and time seemed to stop. Sammy, now 10 years old, stood in the doorway, his face cautious but curious. Behind him were Lex and Juanita, their faces hesitant, their eyes wide. They looked older, taller, more grown up than she had imagined. Her babies were no longer babies. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks as she whispered, "I'm your mom. I've missed you all so much." For a moment, no one moved. Then Sammy stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. His voice was quiet, uncertain but steady. "I remember you," he said. "You used to sing to us, in English." Those words shattered the last of Livia's restraint. A sob broke from her chest, her body trembling as she covered her mouth with her hands. Yes, I did. I sang to you every night." Slowly, hesitantly, the children moved closer. Sammy led the way, his protective instincts evident as he kept Lex and Juanita close. When they reached her, Livia knelt on the floor, her arms open but not pushing, waiting for them to make the choice. Lex was the first to move. He stepped into her arms, his small body stiff with uncertainty but seeking comfort. Livia held him gently, her tears falling into his hair as she whispered, "I love you. I never stopped loving you." Anita stood back, her eyes filled with questions. Livia looked at her, her heart aching at the distance in her daughter's gaze. "I'm here now, Juanita. I'm here, and I'm never leaving again." Juanita hesitated, then took a tiny step forward. It was all Livia needed. She pulled her daughter into her arms, holding her close as she whispered 1,000 apologies, 1,000 promises. Sammy stood last, his eyes filled with wisdom and pain far beyond his years. Livia looked at him, her heart breaking at the guarded expression on his face. "Sammy, my brave boy, I missed you so much. I'm so proud of you." Sammy's chin trembled, his fists clenching as he fought to stay strong. But then his resolve crumbled and he threw himself into his mother's arms, his body shaking as he cried. You left us," he sobbed, his words muffled against her shoulder. Livia held him tight, her own tears falling freely. "I know, baby. I know, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted to leave. I had to, but I promised I'd come back. And here I am." The next 2 hours were a blur of tears, laughter, and hesitant conversations. Livia listened as the children shared stories of their lives, of school, of friends she didn't know, of experiences she had missed. Her heart broke with every detail, but she smiled, nodding, letting them take the lead, letting them set the pace. She showed them the gifts she had brought, books, toys, clothes, but nothing could compare to the gift of time, of presence, of being there with them after 5 long years apart. When the social worker announced that the visit was over, Livia felt her heart break all over again. She clung to them, whispering, "I'll see you next month, I promise. I'll be here." As they walked away, Lex looked back, his little hand waving as tears rolled down his cheeks. "Don't forget us, Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking. Livia sobbed, her hand pressed to her mouth as she choked out, "Never, never, my loves. I'll never forget you." Walking out of the visitation center, Livia felt a surge of determination stronger than anything she had ever known. The battle was far from over. Maid would fight her every step of the way. He had already filed an appeal, and the legal war was far from won. But Livia was ready. She had seen her children, touched them, held them, and heard them call her Mama again. That was enough to give her the strength to keep fighting. She realized then that her fight was no longer just about legal rights. It was about rebuilding bonds, reclaiming trust, and healing the wounds left by years of separation. It was about Sammy, who remembered her songs, about Lex, whose sadness broke her heart, and about Juanita, who was learning to trust her again. Back in the US, Livia's story caught the media's attention. She became the face of a movement, speaking out for mothers separated from their children by borders and unjust laws. She shared her story, her pain, and her hope. She became a voice for those who couldn't speak, a symbol of resilience and love. The support she received was overwhelming. Letters flooded in from around the world, messages of encouragement from strangers who believed in her fight. Human rights organizations rallied to her cause, offering legal aid and political advocacy. Livia realized that her battle was bigger than herself. It was about changing laws, challenging systems, and fighting for justice for countless families torn apart. Each month, she returned to Saudi Arabia for the supervised visits, each time growing closer to her children, each time breaking down another wall built by Maid's lies. Sammy began to trust her again, his guarded heart slowly opening. Juanita's laughter returned, bright and innocent. Lex clung to her every visit, whispering, "Don't leave again, Mama, please. Don't go." With every hug, every smile, every whispered "I love you," Livia's resolve grew stronger. She knew the road to full reunification would be long and filled with battles, but she was prepared. She had hope, she had love, and she had the courage to keep fighting. As the sun set over the city, Livia closed her eyes, her heart whispering a promise to her children. "We'll be together again, no matter how long it takes. No matter what I have to do, I'll find a way to bring you home." With that vow echoing in her soul, Livia prepared for the next battle, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Because a mother's love knew no borders, bowed to no unjust law, and surrendered to no obstacle. And with that love as her driving force, Livia knew she would find her way back to her children. This was just the beginning of her fight for freedom and love. But the journey was far from over. Every goodbye at the end of each visit shattered Livia's heart anew. She watched her children grow, Sammy becoming a teenager, Lex growing curious and bold, and Juanita blossoming with intelligence, all from a distance. She was there, yet she wasn't. She witnessed milestones and changes but could not be part of their everyday lives. Each farewell left her feeling as if she was leaving pieces of herself behind, over and over again. Nights were the hardest. Livia would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down her face as she remembered their faces, their laughter, their voices calling her Mama. The weight of her battle sometimes felt unbearable, but every morning she would rise, look at herself in the mirror, and remind herself of her purpose. For Sammy, Lex, and Juanita. For all the mothers who had been forced to leave their children behind. For justice. For love. Time passed, and Livia began to see changes in her children. Sammy, now a teenager, started questioning the stories Maid had told them about their mother. He began to see the contradictions, the gaps in the narrative. Lex, growing up in a society with strict limitations on girls, looked at her mother with newfound admiration, seeing in her the courage to fight against the odds. Juanita, though still young, was beginning to understand the complexities of their family's situation. It was during one of these visits, while they sat together under the shade of a tree, that Sammy asked the question Livia had longed to hear and feared in equal measure. "Mama," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously to the social worker who was watching them, Could we come live with you in the US? Livia's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked at her son, his eyes filled with hope and fear. It was the question she had dreamed of for years, but also the one she had dreaded. How could she answer without giving him false hope? How could she explain the complexity of the legal battle they were entangled in? "Sweetheart," she began, her voice gentle but trembling, "nothing would make me happier, but it's complicated. Your father has custody and the laws here—" "I know," Sammy interrupted, his voice firm and determined, "but we're not little kids anymore. Don't we have a right to decide?" Livia's heart swelled with pride and pain. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Yes, you do, and maybe we can find a way to make that happen." That conversation lit a fire inside Livia, a spark of hope that she had been too afraid to allow herself before. If her children wanted to live with her, if they could express that desire in court, then maybe, just maybe, they could find a way. With renewed determination, Livia and her legal team began working on a new strategy. They focused on the children's right to have a say in decisions affecting their lives, emphasizing their growing maturity and ability to articulate their desires. It was a risky approach, in a country where paternal authority was nearly absolute, but it was a chance they had to take. The following months were a blur of legal meetings, visits with her children, and advocacy work. Livia poured everything she had into the fight, using every resource, every connection, every ounce of strength she possessed. She refused to let fear or doubt creep in. She was fighting for them, for their future, for their freedom. Finally, the day of the crucial hearing arrived. Livia walked into the courtroom, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She wore conservative attire and a headscarf, presenting herself with respect for the cultural norms, but her spine was straight, her chin held high. Maid was already there, his face cold and unyielding. For the first time, her children were present too. Sammy stood tall, his shoulders squared with a quiet determination. Lex looked at her with wide, hopeful eyes, and Hanita clung to Sammy's side, her face a mixture of curiosity and fear. The trial was brutal. Livia's attorneys argued eloquently for the children's right to maintain a relationship with both parents and to have a voice in their own lives. They spoke of the emotional toll of separation, of the bond between mother and child that no distance could sever. Maid's lawyers countered with ferocity, painting Livia as a selfish woman who had chosen her freedom over her children. They argued that the children's lives were stable and secure with their father, that uprooting them would be harmful and disruptive. Then came the moment Livia had both dreaded and prayed for. The judge called Sammy to the stand. Livia held her breath, her hands trembling as she watched her son walk forward with his head held high. He looked so much older than his years, so much braver than she could have imagined. With a voice steady and mature beyond his age, Sammy spoke. "I love my father," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But I love my mother too, and I want to know her. I want to know her world." His voice cracked with emotion, his eyes shining with tears. "We deserve to have both our parents. We deserve to know where we come from, to understand both sides of our family. It's not fair to take that away from us." He looked at the judge with a courage that brought tears to Livia's eyes. "Please, let us spend time with her. Let us know her. Let us love her, the way we're supposed to." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Maid looked shaken, his face pale and his fists clenched. The judge's expression softened, his gaze lingering on Sammy for a moment before he nodded, his voice gentle. "Thank you, Sammy. You spoke very bravely today." The judge announced that he needed time to deliberate, and the verdict would be delivered in a few weeks. For Livia, the waiting was agony. She clung to the memory of Sammy's words, replaying them in her mind over and over again, praying that they would be enough. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. Livia stood in the courtroom, her body trembling as the judge began to speak. After carefully considering all aspects of this case, including the wishes expressed by the children, this court has reached a decision. Livia's heart pounded, her breath caught in her throat. Custody is hereby granted to the mother, Livia, on a shared basis. The children will spend half the year in the United States with their mother and the other half in Saudi Arabia with their father. The words echoed through the courtroom, and for a moment, Livia couldn't breathe. Then the tears came, hot and overwhelming, as she covered her mouth with her hands, her body shaking with sobs of relief. She looked at her children, their faces bright with joy and hope, and she knew that the fight had been worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every heartbreak, it had all led to this moment. It wasn't the complete victory she had dreamed of, but it was a beginning. It was a chance to rebuild, to reconnect, to finally be a family again. And with that glimmer of hope, Livia knew that this was not the end. It was only the beginning of their journey toward healing, toward love, toward home. The world seemed to stop. Livia stood frozen, her breath caught in her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Had she heard the judge correctly? Had the impossible truly happened? The courtroom erupted into chaos. Maid leapt to his feet, his face twisted in fury, his voice booming as he shouted in protest. His lawyers scrambled to contain the situation, already demanding an appeal, their voices blending into a cacophony of objections, but Livia heard none of it. Her eyes were locked on her children. Sammy stood tall, his face alight with hope and disbelief. Lex's eyes were wide with wonder, his lips trembling with a smile he didn't dare to let break free. Hanita clung to her brothers, her face a mixture of joy and fear, her tiny body trembling with emotion. Livia's heart shattered and rebuilt itself in the same instant. They were hers again. She would finally have the chance to be their mother, not just for a few precious hours each month, but for half the year. She could show them the life she had once dreamed of giving them, the country and culture she had been forced to leave behind. Tears streamed down her face as she took a shaky step toward them, her body moving on instinct, her heart leading the way. Sammy was the first to run, his arms wrapping around her with a force that nearly knocked her off her feet. "Mama, we're coming home!" Livia sobbed, her body shaking as she held him, her fingers tangling in his hair as she whispered, "Yes, my love, you're coming home. We're going home together." Lex threw himself into her embrace, his little arms squeezing tight as he cried into her shoulder. "Don't leave again, Mama. Promise, you won't leave again." Livia kissed his head, her tears falling into his hair. I promise with all my heart. We'll be together now, always." Anita came last, her body trembling as she stepped forward, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Mama, is it really true? Are you really staying?" Livia sank to her knees, reaching out her arms. "It's true, sweetheart. I'm staying. We're going to be together. Nothing will ever take me from you again." Anita's face crumpled as she flung herself into her mother's arms, her tiny body shaking with sobs as she clung to Livia with all her might. "I missed you, Mama. I missed you so much." Livia held them, her children wrapped in her arms, their bodies pressed to her heart, her tears falling freely as she whispered over and over, "I love you, I love you, I love you so much." The room continued to buzz with noise. Maddie's shouts, the lawyers' arguments, the judge's attempts to restore order. But for Livia, the world had narrowed to this one moment. Her babies were in her arms, her heart was whole again. As they left the courtroom, surrounded by her legal team, Livia felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Maddie's threats echoed behind them, his voice promising appeals and battles yet to come. But she was no longer afraid. She had won this battle, and no amount of bitterness or anger could take this victory from her. That night, in her hotel room, Livia called her mother in the US. Her hands shook as she dialed the number, her heart thudding as she heard her mother's voice. "Mom, we did it. We're coming home, all of us." Her mother's sobs broke through the phone, her voice trembling with joy and relief. "Oh, Livia, thank God, thank God. I've prayed for this every day. Bring them home, darling, bring them home." As she hung up, Livia stood at the window looking out over the city that had once been her prison. She had arrived here broken and defeated, but now she stood victorious, her children by her side. Tomorrow she would begin the preparations to take them home to the United States. It would be a new beginning, a chance to heal the wounds of the past and to build a future together. That night, as she tucked her children into bed, she watched them sleep, their faces peaceful and safe for the first time in years. She ran her fingers through their hair, kissed their foreheads and whispered, "We're free now. We're finally free." In the darkness, Livia lay beside them, her heart full of gratitude and hope. The struggle had been long and agonizing, the cost unbearably high, but it had been worth it. She had fought with everything she had, driven by a love that knew no borders and bowed to no law. And in the end, a mother's love had triumphed. As the first light of dawn touched the sky, Livia closed her eyes, her heart whispering a prayer of thanks. We'll be together now. We'll be a family again. And with that promise echoing in her soul, Livia finally allowed herself to sleep, dreaming of the day they would walk together on American soil, finally free to be the family they were always meant to be. Thank you so much for joining me on this emotional and unforgettable journey. Livia's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes dreams come wrapped in shadows, and not all that glitters is gold. From stepping into a life of luxury to fighting for her freedom, her journey shows us the power of resilience, the unbreakable strength of a mother's love, and the courage to reclaim one's life, even against impossible odds. If this story moved you as much as it did me, don't forget to hit that like button and share it with others who need a reminder of the strength within us all. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe for more incredible stories of hope, courage, and transformation. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and remember, every chapter, no matter how dark, leads us closer to the light.